Hi, I'm Nathan Johnston, and in this video we are going to look at the configuration of the IO3530 in iecTeso. The IO3530 is a 6 analog input, 2 analog output I/O module for PC3 controllers. First, we must create some variables for connecting to the I/O points. All I/O on the IO3530 must be configured as type analog channel. This is a structure that contains the I/O value being read for analog inputs or written for analog outputs, a safe value which is applicable to analog outputs and is the value the card will output should it lose communications with the processor module, and an error feedback signal. The attribute should be set to read for analog inputs and free for analog outputs. And the direction should be set to input for analog inputs and output for analog outputs. Once this has been created, we need to go to the I/O wiring screen. In this case, my I/O boards have already been mapped into the project. However, the board remains unconfigured. If you need help on the configuration of the I/O board and you do not have access to the user manual, you can select the board and press the device help button. This will display the help box with information about the configuration. If we expand out all the items within the board, we can see we have some parameters for the overall board, an analog inputs board which contains the 6 analog inputs, and an analog output board which contains the 2 analog outputs. The parameters field contains an analog filter constant. This is the time constant for the analog inputs, which is specified in milliseconds. If the value is set to 0, the filter will be disabled. And a timeout, which is how long the module will operate without communications with the processor module before it applies the safe state values to the outputs. With the analog inputs, clicking on this will show all unwired variables. Now, if you have not configured the variables correctly in the dictionary, they will not appear. It will only show variables that are of the correct type and direction, in this case analog channel and inputs. Further to this, it will only display unwired variables. So if you wish to reallocate I/O from other I/O boards, you must first disconnect them for them to appear in this list. To map I/O, we simply select the desired unwired variable and drag and drop it onto a given I/O point. The analog input board also contains a parameters section which allows us to define the physical configuration of the analog inputs on the IO3530. Each analog input can be pre-configured in the factory to be a voltage input, either unipolar or bipolar, a current input, or a resistive input. The mode string defines the configuration in a string with 6 characters. The first character defining the configuration of analog input 1 through to the last character defining the configuration of analog input 6. The values entered should be V for voltage, unipolar, B for bipolar voltage, I for current, and R for resistive. In this case, I know this I/O board has been configured for the first 3 analog inputs being resistive and the final 3 analog inputs being current. Once again, these values must match the configuration of the I/O board. If you are unsure about this configuration, you should contact OEM. Moving on to the analog output board. When you select the board, it will display all unwired variables that are of the correct type and direction. In this case, analog channel type and output direction. As with the analog inputs, we simply drag and drop the unwired variables onto the I/O points. And like the analog inputs, there is also a parameters section that allows us to define the physical configuration of the outputs. In this case, my analog output card has been configured for voltage, so the default string is correct. Now that all unwired variables have been connected, I can save the changes made to the I/O wiring screen, compile my project, and download it. We can then debug the connection and go back to the I/O wiring screen. By selecting on the board, it will show the current values being read by the board. We can also go to the dictionary for the variables, expand out their structures to see their values. Now, it's important that we check that the error value is 0. If it is a value other than 0, you should refer to the user manual for an explanation for the associated error code. For further information on the IO3530, please refer to the IO3530 user manual.